Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing? There we go, yes. So we're a little bit late, so I'll go ahead and jump right to it, but it's my pleasure and privilege to invite Ryan Holiday. He's a writer and strategist. He's worked with the likes of Tim Ferriss, Google, Complex Media, and several other best-selling authors. And now he's here to talk to us about his new book, Ego is the Enemy. Previously, he has written 3 other books. The last one, The Obstacle is the Way, has become a big success with the likes of NFL players, rappers, and competitive athletes. So we're very lucky to have him here, and now we're excited to hear about his new book. So please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you. Awesome. Is this the clicker? Okay, perfect. How's everyone doing? So this is my first talk for the book, so I hope you can enjoy being my test audience. Actually, no, I made this one up just for you guys. I hope I'm not biting the hand that feeds me a little bit, but there's some Google mentions, so we'll get into it. I set out to write a book a few years ago. Actually, the topic was going to be about humility. That ended up being much harder than I thought. And as I was sort of meditating on this idea, oh, there's a monitor up there, very cool. As I was meditating on this idea, it occurred to me, I remember exactly where I was. I was standing in the American Apparel parking lot because unlike Google, we didn't have all these awesome pods where you could take private phone calls. So I was on the phone and I was thinking about this book and I was sort of talking it through and it occurred to me that we're all in one of 3 phases in life. And so you can actually see the evolution of the drawings of the idea. So you can see that weird mouth-looking drawing. The idea is, first we're aspiring to something, then from that aspiration either comes success or we fail at that thing, and we're sort of constantly repeating through these things. So I do all my books on these 4x6 note cards. So these are sort of the first 4 note cards of the book. So the idea is you're aspiring, you get some taste of success, then you succeed, maybe you plateau, then you begin to get complacent and you fail, and then you're back to aspiration. Or you succeed and you want to aspire to something else. So this is the idea. And what occurred to me, instead of talking about humility, I would talk about ego, because ego is the opposite of what you need at any of those 3 phases. As Cyril Connolly says, ego sucks us down like the law of gravity. So again, I'm not talking about ego in the Freudian sense, which even after fair amount of reading about, I still don't quite understand. I'm talking about ego in the colloquial sense, the sort of group of traits that we associate with ego: selfishness, delusion, arrogance, greed, the endless competitiveness, what we mean when we say, oh, that's all ego, right? That's what I'm referring to, not, the ego, per a psychologist definition. And so, again, ego, depending on whether we're aspiring, so we're just starting out, we're trying to do something, ego is the worst element you can introduce into that. Those traits are the worst things that you can do. And then when we succeed, if that aspiration is made real, ego manifests itself in a new way, right? Now it's the arrogance is more pronounced, let's say, or we start to have control over other people, so that ego manifests itself in our leadership styles and our management systems. We can start to tell ourselves a story about who we are and how we got to where we are, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then often, because ego is the root of or is undermining our success, that we get into failure. Or something turns out to be harder than what we expected. We have some crisis or scandal, and now again, ego is a negative element to introduce into your life, because it's, instead of learning a lesson, it's taking from this that it's other people's fault or that you'll never recover. So ego is manifesting itself in profoundly different ways wherever we happen to be in life, but in every single phase, it's a negative trait. And so my premise is that ego is the enemy. And I love this quote from Richard Feynman, where he's saying, look, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And that's ego, right? Ego is fooling us precisely when we need to be fully in command of all our senses. We need to be aware of the objective reality of our situations. We need to understand what we're good at and what we're bad at. And so ego is fooling us. I make a distinction in the book between confidence and ego. I say confidence is earned and sort of ego is stolen. Ego is fooling yourself. So that's the premise of the book. Obviously, I thought it'd be a little absurd if I came to Google and I talked to one of the world's most valuable companies. It might be the world's most valuable company. I know you guys are always like this. But it would be foolish for me to come here and talk to you about aspiring to do something as a company level. Obviously, you've achieved an incredible amount. And even just to work here, that's an incredible accomplishment. So we won't talk about that. And things are going pretty well for Google these days. So I'm not going to lecture you on how to recover from failure, because clearly that's not a problem either. So I wanted to talk about success, the way in which success can breed ego and undermine the things that we're trying to do. And so there's a chapter in the book, and the story I wanted to tell today is ironically about not telling yourself a story, and the way that ego can warp and change the stories that we tell ourselves and ultimately lead us astray. So to me, Nassim Taleb, he calls this the narrative fallacy, the way that we cobble together the events of our past into a personal narrative, not just personally, but sometimes about history. We connect disconnected events, and we create a sort of sense of certainty and cohesion that's not really there. As David Maraniss said, myth becomes myth not in the living, but in the retelling. And so when we reflect back on our success, or when we read about our success in the media, success about projects we've worked on or things we've been a part of, the ego is there sort of puffing these things up and making them different than they actually were. And so the story I tell in the book is the story of Bill Walsh, who in 1979 took over the San Francisco 49ers. At that point, they were not just one of the worst teams in football. They may have been one of the worst teams in all of professional sports. Took over as the general manager and the coach. He'd previously been the coach at Stanford, and he sort of immediately set about trying to change. They were sort of fully ensconced in a culture of losing. It was a bad franchise. In fact, the year before he took over, the team was 2-14. And then he took over, and he did a lot of work. He drafted some good players. But that season, the first season as a coach, they were 2-14 again. And not only 2-14, they currently, or they still hold the record for the only team to lead in 12 games and still lose them. So it was a miserable, horrible season. And then the next season was almost as bad. They went 6-10 in 1980. But they were so bad that year that he almost quit about halfway through the season. And so it was a pretty bad ride. And the next season, they won the Super Bowl. They beat the Cincinnati Bengals. This is a season that features the catch, maybe one of the most famous plays in all of football. But they win, and here he is hoisted on the shoulders of his players. And he is quickly hailed as the genius, right? He turned a team around in probably the shortest amount of time in NFL history. Again, he took it from the worst franchise to the best franchise in 3 seasons. This is unheard of. And yet, Bill Walsh, even at that time, there's a famous article where they're talking about his sort of response to the victory. What he was, the announcer says, "Oh, he must be numb." He's just sort of sitting there, not looking on the sidelines. And in fact, Bill Walsh told the announcer later that he was just thinking about the next season. But he's quickly decried as like the greatest name in football. And he put all that aside. He ignored that label. And he not only ignored the sort of narrative of taking from the worst to the best at the time, but even when he writes his memoirs years later, he's still resisting that. And the reason is he knew that what was actually responsible for the 49ers winning was what he called the standard of performance. And this was the standards that he put on his players at the time. And they were pretty stringent. There was no sitting on the playing fields. Coaches had to wear suit and ties. Sportsmanship was stressed almost to an absurd degree. Work ethic was prized above all things. No fighting, no swearing. All these things were banned. linemen were drilled on at least sort of 30 different drills. There's a lot for linemen. Passing routes for receivers were actually measured down to the inch. The practices were scheduled down to the minute. And so what Walsh had always said is that if we adhere to these standards of performance, if we take care of them, the score will take care of itself. And so what he was focused on then was not turning around this franchise. He said the first question he was asked by reporters was always, what's your timetable for turning around the 49ers? And what he would say over and over again is, I don't have a timetable. And he really meant it. One of the assistant coaches at the time actually complained to the boss that Walsh didn't have a timetable and that it wasn't going to be fast enough, and Walsh fired him. So Walsh's point was, actually, I don't know when we're going to win, and I don't know how long it's going to take. All I know is that if we adhere to these standards, eventually we will win. He said that the job of a coach is to help a team make a base camp near the summit. And so if you sort of sketch that metaphor out a little bit, what he's saying is you make base camp near the summit, and then only weather permitting do you make that run. And so it just happened, as he understood it, that the run to the summit, to the Super Bowl, was within 3 seasons instead of 7 seasons or even 1 season. And so what he was resisting then, because he was actually there at the time, he knew that it wasn't so simple as worst team in football to best team in football. And he knew that the story telling himself that he was a genius, or that the team might tell itself a story that they were the best, that they were somehow special, that this is a very dangerous thing to do. And in fact, the next 2 seasons, the Super Bowl, as often happens to teams, when they win, they start to be sort of the bonds that bring the team together start to fray, egos start to come in. The 49ers lost 12 of the next 22 games. And so, but Walsh stuck with what he thought was important, which was these standards of performance. And so what happens, though, when you're successful is that other people try to remove that context, that sort of nitty gritty, the idea that he almost quit halfway through because he didn't think it was working, or that it was the little things that mattered and not his sort of bold, audacious plans. The narrative that's built around you and that you build around yourself starts to overpower the reality of your situation. Tobias Wolff, who's actually a professor at Stanford, he's a brilliant short story writer, he's saying that all of this gets cobbled together later, and sincerely so, and after the stories get repeated enough times, they put on the badge of memory, and this is the important part, they block the routes of exploration. So you stop being able to see your own life objectively. You've repeated this story enough times that it starts to become true. And so that's what Walsh was resisting, not only at the time, but then decades later. And the reason is, again, is that stories, they don't change the past. You can tell yourself whatever you want about the past. The problem is what you tell yourself about the past, particularly if it's a sort of a flattering way, it can change your future. It changes how you respond to things. So it's about making sure that we learn the right lessons from our stories, that we're telling ourselves the right stories. And a few years ago, I worked on a book with Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler. I did the marketing for it. And as I was watching some of the videos that they had produced, there was a video that Peter had hosted at Singularity University, and your CEO and brilliant co-founder, he spoke at. And he said this line on stage, and I thought it was really interesting. He said, I now have a very simple metric I use, and this is for companies that he invests in or acquires. He's saying, are you working on something that can change the world? Yes or no? And this is a very inspiring thing. And I remember when I saw it, I was like, that's awesome. And then I thought a little bit more about it, and I wondered if there isn't a little bit of that storytelling going on, the way that we can sort of look backwards at ourselves and create clarity or vision that wasn't necessarily there. And it struck me that I'm not sure some of Google's biggest successes would meet that criteria, not at the time, right? So here's the Stanford PhD paper that Larry and Sergey wrote together, right? They weren't trying necessarily to create a company that would change the world. It wasn't this bold, brilliant vision to create billions and billions of dollars worth of wealth and employ thousands and thousands of people and create all these different interesting products. It was exploring theoretically an idea about how search might be organized. Or if you look at YouTube, right, people forget because the narrative that the media tells, it's sort of glosses over this. In fact, even the YouTube founders talk about it differently. But YouTube started as a dating site. And this is the first video ever uploaded on YouTube. You can see this cool, he's at the zoo, he's at the zoo, I guess, talking about how he likes to go to the zoo, and maybe you would want to come to the zoo with him. And so here's a quote from him, and he's saying, "We didn't even know how to describe our new product. To generate interest, we just said that it was a new kind of dating site. We even had a slogan for it, tune in and hook up." So obviously what YouTube is now and what it's done is almost unbelievable, but it can be easy to forget what it actually was when it started. And I think Gmail's the same way, right? Gmail, I've heard some conflicting reports that the idea was always to do Gmail, or really it was a Google 20% project. In any case, not everyone thought it was a good idea at the time, right? Here's Paul, who created Gmail. He's saying a lot of people thought it was a very bad idea, both from a product and a strategic standpoint. They thought maybe it would piss off competitors, or that it wouldn't work, that it was sort of outside search. And then Brian Rakowski, who is the first project manager on Gmail, is saying it didn't look anything like what Gmail does now, or even what it looked at, that it was just radically different. And here's a screenshot. My favorite part of this screenshot, can I do a laser point? If you see, whoever took this screenshot was also on something awful at the same time. So I think it's pretty awesome. So this is Gmail when it launched, right? It's radically different than what it was. And actually, Jeff Bezos has talked about this a little bit too. He has to remind himself over and over again, because it's what reporters want to hear, that there was no aha moment in the creation of Amazon. That the aha moment is what makes for a compelling story, right? It's like we heard eBay was created to sell Pez dispensers, which is also not true. That if you apply retroactively a certain clarity of vision to that wasn't there, it makes it harder when you do ambitious things in the future. And so Paul Graham has two wonderful essays. Actually, the original title of the book that I was working on was Keep Your Identity Small. He's saying you have to keep your identity small because information is constantly changing in the world, and you're constantly being put in new situations. And if you have this sort of overwhelming identity, or if you have this big ego, it makes it hard for you to be flexible, to try different things, to see things objectively and not through your sort of, again, overwhelming lens of the world. And in his other essay on I think it's called Frighteningly Ambitious Startup Ideas, he's saying that the way to do really big things seems to actually be to start with deceptively small things. And I think this is true for most successes. It's not that it's accidental. It's that to have thought when they were writing that PhD dissertation or thesis that the end outcome of it would be one of the world's most valuable companies, and they'd all be billionaires. That would be preposterous, right? This would be preposterously conceited and delusional. And so that wasn't what they were thinking. What they were thinking about is the immediate task at hand. And so as you go out into the world and try to do new ambitious things, it requires that you suppress that ego so you can see them clearly and objectively, and not through the lens of the story that you tell yourself or the image that you have in yourself. And so I don't mean to rub it in, but you look at Google Glass, right? And some of the failures of Google Glass, and I think some of Google's other problems have come from the fact that being an incredibly successful company that has built all these transformational products is that you start to try to take some shortcuts, and you say, well, can't we just start with a transformational idea? Or you say, this is certainly going to be transformational, so let's put tons of resources behind it. So what you get away from is what Paul Graham is saying, is you get away from the deceptively small things. And this is what Bill Walsh was worried about. It's getting away from the deceptively small things that actually matter a great deal, right? It's having pride or sportsmanship, pride in doing good work, having the right work ethic, holding yourself to a certain standard of excellence. These are the things that win games, or that put you in a position to win games. And you want to make sure that the fact that you have won a game doesn't lead to you abandoning those principles. And this happens time and time again. And so what I'm talking about then is learning the right lessons from your past. And there's a wonderful quote from Elizabeth Noel Newman. She's an artist, and she talked about this in one of my favorite books on creativity. It's actually, the book is just called Creativity, and it's by Mill Haley. I'm not even going to begin to butcher his last name, but if you just look it up on Amazon or Google it, it's wonderful. But she's saying, I never look back except to look at mistakes. There's only danger in looking back at things that you're proud of. So what I'm talking about then, what I think suppresses the ego, is looking at events retroactively to find out not what you did amazingly well or what says something about you as a person, but instead where you need to and where you can improve. And so hopefully you'll humor me for another football story. This is Tom Brady on draft day. Tom Brady was drafted 199th in the NFL draft in the year 2000. He was drafted in the 6th round. And so in terms of pure performance, this is, or ROI, this is undoubtedly the greatest draft pick in the history of football, right? He starts for 14 seasons. He'll be starting for his 14th season. He's been to 6 Super Bowls. He's won 4 times, 3 Super Bowl MVPs. He's been to the Pro Bowl 12 times. He's thrown for like 60,000 yards. It's an absurd track record for a singular quarterback. He's played all his years on the same team and built probably the most dominant franchise in the history of football as well. So, but he's drafted in the 6th round. So, right, 6th round. So it becomes this, hey, we're going to do all these other things first and maybe, and then, it leads to this, right? And so you would think that the Patriots would see this as a massive success, right? That they got this steal. But that's actually not the lesson that they took from this. What they took from it instead, I think, is a very humble lesson, and one I try to apply in my own life as well. They were upset, right? Not because they're perfectionists, but because the lesson that Belichick and his head of personnel, which is, his name was Scott, no longer with the Patriots, but what they took from this is, we were really wrong. How could we have let this superstar wait until the 6th round? Somebody else could have taken him. And so what they're seeing then is not that they got this steal, but how fortuitous that it worked out in their favor was, and how easily it could have not gone that way. Because not only did they draft him 199th, but he was set to be the 3rd string quarterback. He barely beat the 2nd string quarterback, and it was only when the Patriots starter, Drew Bledsoe, injured himself in Brady's 2nd season that Tom Brady was able to get his shot. And then he did so amazingly well, they ended up winning the Super Bowl that year. And so what the Patriots saw is how easily this all could have gone the other direction. And so I think this is the opposite of being full of yourself. This is, as I would say, it's looking for the failure inside the success. And this is preventing those things from going to your head. One of my favorite lines in the children's book, The Little Prince, is he says, vain men never hear anything but praise. And that's the problem. If your vanity or your ego is there, all you're going to see in your stories is the things that have gone well. And you're not going to see the things that could have gone better or that you lucked out. Again, for some football, Vince Lombardi says nobody ever wins a championship and then looks backwards and says, man, if the ref hadn't blown that call in the middle of the season, we never would have been here. Or that if that ball had bounced inbounds instead of out of bounds, it would be a totally different story. We tend to only look and make it, we only look at it in our favor. And so one of the things the Patriots did as a reminder of this, Scott Pioli, he had on his desk, he had a picture of Dave's, I don't want to butcher his name is either, it was Stachelski. He had a picture of him on his desk for the rest of the time at the Patriots, because this is the player that the Patriots drafted over Tom Brady. They drafted him in the 5th round, and he didn't even make it through training camp. He ended up having a career with a couple other teams, but this was the guy that they thought they were confidently picking in the 5th round ended up being not even remotely close to as good as the guy they got lucky to get in the 6th round. So it's this sort of reminder. Again, it's not looking backwards to see what you're proud of. It's looking backwards to see what mistakes you might have made and the things that you could do better. I'll give you an example of my own life. So I wrote a book 2 years ago called The Obstacle is the Way. And I think I did a pretty good job, but it sort of, I was not thinking that this would happen. I would not think that this book about ancient philosophy would somehow make its way through professional sports, coincidentally also to the Patriots. This was not what I was thinking. So that's sort of lesson number one. I have to remember very vividly that my intention was to write a book for business people. That's what I was thinking, or just for people who are interested in history and business. I wanted to write a book for them. And it just happened that it sort of accidentally made its way into this circle. So that was sort of lesson number one. The bigger lesson for me is that of all the things, the book has sold pretty well, but I have to be, as I'm launching this book, I was trying to think, like, why was that book successful and why did it sell well? And sort of looking back at the sales record, this is, have you guys ever heard of BookBub? It's this cool newsletter, and they just recommend discounted ebooks once a day. So it's sort of like Groupon for books, although you don't buy them from them, you buy them from Amazon or any retailer. And so we did, about 3 weeks after the book came out, I had suggested to my publisher that we just try this new thing called BookBub. It wasn't super huge then, and we tried. So we discounted the ebook from $12.99 or whatever it was to $3.99, and it was supposed to run for a week. And it ran for a week, and it had a nice spike in sales. And then, still don't totally know how this happened, but Amazon kept the discount. And they kept the discount for 11 months. So, like, we all know that discounting in the short term can be really great. The reason you don't do it in the long term is, it can reduce the overall amount of revenue. But Amazon not only discounted it, but they discounted it and they paid the full royalty the whole time. So it was this sort of, I don't know how it happened, honestly. I'm very grateful, obviously. But what I think happened is, we did this service, and it created a spike in Amazon's algorithm, and then Amazon, just like you guys, is very smart with data, and they saw, hey, if we keep this artificially low, it will sell over the long term, and maybe they forgot about it. I don't know what happened. But so for 11 months, my book was basically sold as a loss leader by the biggest retailer in the world. And obviously, this contributed to sales in a huge way. If I look at the data, ebook sold way more than audiobook, ebook sold way more than ebook sold way more than physical, and usually they're about like 60-40. It was like flipped. And this was a result of the discounting. So basically, the book was able to be discovered, or people were able to take a chance on it in a way that worked out very well, but again, was totally unintentional. So I have to look at that lesson as I'm launching the next book. I'm not thinking, oh, the baseline is I'm going to sell as many copies as the last one. You have to say, if this fortuitous event does not occur again, how is that going to work out for me? You don't want to take for granted something that you didn't have anything to do with. At the same time, the right lesson I think you take from that is experimenting and trying new things can often work out really well, and that there can be upsides that you can't anticipate for doing things that maybe other people are afraid to do. And then also, when you get a lucky break, ride that thing for as long as you can. And we didn't send Amazon an email and say, hey, we don't want this. They opened the door and we walked through it, and we stayed on the other side for as long as possible, right? So, you learn, okay, look, books, there is a sort of a price elasticity in book sales, and that targeted discounting can be good for discovery. So it's about, again, it's taking the right lessons and making sure that, the difference between, an objective event happens, right? You win a Super Bowl, or, your book sells well, or you acquire a site and it becomes the destination for all video in the world, or, your Stanford thesis becomes a billion-dollar company. An objective event happens. I would say learning the right lesson from that objective event. To me, ego is the swing vote there. Ego. If you look through the world with an egotistical lens, you're going to be telling yourself, of course, that this says something about you as a person, that it says you are a genius, or you're a great marketer. It says this thing about you. And not only is that dangerous because it's not true, but the other side of that coin is that when things go poorly, you tell yourself the same thing. You tell yourself, this says something about me as a person, that I'm a failure because my thing failed, and my company's a failure because this project failed. And so it might be nice when you're on top, but it's particularly vicious when fate turns against you. And my last book was about Stoicism, and the Stoics are always talking about having an attitude that's resilient in case that always happens. So ego is that difference. My favorite Stoic quote is from Marcus Aurelius. He's saying to accept it without arrogance and to let it go with indifference. And that's sort of what we're talking about when it comes to these stories is know what's actually happening, don't let it puff you up and make you more than what you are. But also when things go poorly, or there's mistakes, or there's problems, or hey, you write a book and some news event interrupts, and people aren't buying books that week. That that it's the standard of performance that you adhere to that make this thing a quality, and that it will prevail in the end, or whatever that is. So I wanted to leave you guys with that today. One sort of meditation on how ego can manifest itself in success, and how you have to be on guard against it. And on a lighter note, so you didn't think I was lecturing, I thought, oh, sorry, this is one of my favorite quotes. Sorry, but it goes to the same point. This is from Marina Abramovic, and she's saying, if you start believing in your own greatness, it is the death of your creativity. It's not just the death of your creativity. I think it's also the death of the work that needs to go in to bring a creative thing into the world and then into the market. So, ego is that swing vote. Believing in your own greatness is whether you're going to learn the right lesson, you're going to tell yourself the right story, and humility and self-awareness is going to determine whether you tell yourself the right story. And I thought I'd leave you with this picture of my donkey eating a copy of a book. But anyways, that's it for me. Thank you guys for having me. Take some questions.
We've got mics.
Or you can throw me out for daring to insult Google.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So, I don't know if you've heard about this, but I think all nooglers know about this.
What's that mean?
And it's imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
It's this kind of well-known fact that people who start working here don't feel like they belong here, or that they deserve to be working here. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that, in relation to the things that you just talked about.
I've gone through a little bit of that myself, so I understand. I guess objectively, what you tell yourself is like, look, the people who hire at Google are pretty smart. They're not really in the business of hiring people who don't deserve to work there, and so they're probably right, even if you might doubt it. But one of the things I talk about in the book is I think people sometimes think that ego is the opposite of humility. And I'm not sure that that's true. I talk in the book, Aristotle's golden mean basically says that all virtues are a midpoint between two vices, or two extremes. So he's saying, courage is a midpoint between brashness on one side, and say cowardice on the other. And so I think what you're trying to develop as a human being, confidence then is a midpoint between, egotism and delusion, and on the other hand, sort of self-loathing and crippling self-doubt. And I think you get that confidence not by saying like, oh, this job is very important and I'm not important, and so therefore, I'm an imposter. I think what you look at is, you look at your accomplishments, you look at the work that went into getting you where you are. And again, this is telling yourself the right story. I got hired by Google because I worked hard in high school and I got into this college, and I did well in this school when other people were doing X, and I built these projects on the side, or I did all these things. So it's making sure that you're taking pride not in the fact that you work at an amazing, elite company. It's that you're taking pride in the work that you do and who you are and what you bring to the table. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, for
Awesome.
sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, I was just curious how you ended up thinking and writing about this stuff. And then the other is, do you have any comments about Elon Musk?
I think Elon Musk is really fascinating, and the whole second section of the book opens with the story of Howard Hughes, who I find to be fascinating. It's probably although he was a brilliant creative visionary, probably the single worst businessman of the 21st century. He just happened to inherit a company that had a monopoly on oil drilling, and it funded all these ridiculous projects. But actually, I'd always known about Howard Hughes, and I'd read a little bit about him, but I thought of him for this book because I'd read an interview with Elon Musk where he said that he'd been reading about Howard Hughes as a cautionary tale. And I think that's really interesting because they're both brilliant. Obviously, they're both fascinated by aviation. They're both entrepreneurs. They both created multiple companies. But Howard Hughes died in sort of self-exile and misery and addiction and insanity. And so I liked that he was sort of studying that, although I saw the news yesterday about him announcing that he was going to acquire one of his own companies and sort of being somewhat mystified that people would be skeptical of this, right, or suspicious of this. And I think one of the things that ego makes very difficult is empathy, and even if not just empathy, like understanding optics, right? And so often when you are egotistical and you are surrounded by people who are dependent on you, it becomes very hard for you to see the world the way other people who are not you would see the world. But that is an essential skill when you are managing not just multiple companies, but the high wire act of public relations and branding involved in the kinds of companies that he's doing. So I think Elon Musk is really interesting. I don't know him personally or know enough about him to make any judgments one way or another, but I was fascinated by ego. So my last book was about external obstacles, and I sort of wanted to write, I'm hoping I'm not making up a story here, I sort of wanted to write about internal, like what makes those things impossible, right? And I found that sort of self-awareness was essential in the kind of objectivity and perseverance required. So I was interested in that, and also I got, I put my email in all my books and stuff, and so I get a lot of emails from people, and I tend to find that the vast majority of the problems that people are coming to me with, it's clear that it's a completely self-inflicted problem. Like it's just they're not able to see their own situation with any sort of objectivity. They don't see how they're making things worse for themselves, and so I wanted to write about sort of self-awareness and humility, and actually. I also was interested in the way that social media creates a sort of weird performance art where we're all pretending we're better than we are. So it was those sort of things that led into the book.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks
Yeah,
for
hey.
coming. Big fan.
Thank you.
One of the things that I really liked about Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers is that he talks about the story of the Beatles and Bill Gates and how we as a society love to feed those egos and build those things up. But he talks about how it really just takes a lot of hard work and a lot of luck.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your perspectives on what it is that gives us a tendency to want to feed other people's egos.
I think we like those stories because then like we're all trying to do something, and so it's like, oh, if they were just brilliant or creative, or they got this lucky break, then that like bodes well for us. Or conversely, we use it as a rationalization for why we're not pursuing something, right? So it's like, oh, that didn't happen to me, so that's why I'm not successful at whatever it is that I'm doing. So you could tell yourself sort of the wrong story in both directions. I think a lot of it also is like, I read this book a couple of years ago called The Accidental City, which is like a history of New Orleans and how it became what it became. And I remember like halfway through, I just quit reading and I was like, there's no narrative here. And it's like the whole point is that it's accidental and there was no narrative, but it just made for really like not super exciting reading. And so I think the other thing is that as human beings, we're sort of hardwired for narrative. Or that it's how our brains work. So we gravitate towards simplifying things and making them more fated or ordained or exciting than they actually were. I think it's interesting. I really like Malcolm Gladwell's stuff too, and I think the 10,000 hours thing is very well supported. I worked on a book with Robert Greene called Mastery, and he says it's actually more like 20,000 hours. One of the things that I have a line in the book, it's more of a throwaway line, but I think one of the hard parts is we see even that, we go, oh, so it just takes 10,000 hours. And then we think it's like, oh, I just check off an hour. Like it's not, it's much more complicated than that, right? It's like, yes, it took 10,000 hours for the Beatles to be great as the Beatles, but also because of where they were and the time and the influences. Like, they were making a living probably before they got 10,000 hours, right? Or maybe that's what it takes for music, but to be a computer programmer, it takes 22,000 hours. Like, there's not like some magical number that you hit, and it's like, you know, if you run 26.2 miles, like, that's a marathon. That's not how it works for mastering something. It's like, it takes a really long time, and then you get pretty good, and then it still takes a really long time, and maybe there's no finish line. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Hell.
Quick question on the perceived value. So we're all in the business of like creating a perceived value of ourselves. Like all of us here, we go to perps, etc.
Sure.
So we
You have your
also
LinkedIn
reflect on our
profile
own.
and- Yeah.
We reflect on our own for our egos, etc., and try to grow.
Yeah.
But including yourself as an author,
Mhm.
you are portraying like
Yes.
a certain. So how do you see that balancing out and that conflict?
Well, one of the things that I think is so interesting that really motivated me to write the book is like, okay, a friend of mine said this. He was like, you know, 20 years ago, only cult leaders had followers. Now everyone has followers, right? Like, because we all have Twitter accounts. And so in the way that social media and sort of the way the world works now, it's like everyone has to have this personal brand. So like it used to be that only an author or like even CEOs were mostly like private people. Like you didn't know who ran maybe General Motors. Like he's not on Squawk Box, you know, 50 years ago. Like so the way in which we now all have to have these personal brands means that we're all susceptible to what was once the sort of temptations and seductions of fame for like celebrities or performers. And like, you know, I could pull up my Instagram feed right now and it's going to present my life in a much more glamorous way than whatever happens in between those photos. And so we're all sort of performing in that way. Sometimes we're performing that way, like I might tell myself it's because I have like sometimes you tell yourself that it's part of the branding or the personal brand that you're maintaining, and other times it's just you sort of chasing, you know, internet points or you know, likes and retweets and hearts and favorites and all these things. So I think one of the things you learn as a marketer is that there is a distinction between the distilled message or campaign that you're doing and then the complex reality that is the product or the company, you know? And I think people have to develop a bit of that sense too, right? The person you are at a job interview is not who you are Sunday night at home on the couch. And making sure that you are not, the tail is not wagging the dog, so to speak, right? That the branding and the marketing, the illusions that you're creating to advance whatever your career are or a message that you have are not changing your perception of yourself. Because that's, you know, it's a short throw from there to sort of living in a Trumpian fantasy world where, you know, you're qualified to be president or whatever.
I have a question here.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
So let me see if I can phrase this well. So a lot of your examples were about, you know, achieving success and people who have been successful, and then, you know, they start from the seed of aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost seems like why is ego, the topic of ego, tightly coupled with success? It seems like you're framing the idea of not having an ego as a service to achieving success. And
Well,
that kind of confuses me because, you know, if you come from Stoicism or Buddhism, they say, you know, the desire, you know, is the root cause of suffering and, you know, things like that.
Sure.
And so is aspiration itself caused from the ego? Like, who's to say that, you know, Mother Teresa, she did amazing work. How do you know that's not driven by ego? Or how do you know that what Steve Jobs did, that was driven by ego, not driven by his ego? Like, where do you draw that line?
No, I think it's a very interesting question. And so obviously, I think these topics are fascinating to me personally, and they're how I try to live my life. The reality is also that we live in a world where people are trying to accomplish things. We have individual goals, we have families to feed, we have you know, beliefs that we hold to be very important, and we are trying to do things. And so I decided in this specific book to look at the ways that ego makes what we are trying to do more difficult than it already is. Now, also personally, I think ego makes relationships very difficult, and it makes, ironically, let's say that ego was only a minor problem in terms of achieving success. Ego is also a problem in the sense that it makes it impossible for you to feel like your success is ever enough. So these things are interrelated. I'm just focusing on one specific part, right? I came to this on the Stoicism book. It's like, I'm really interested in philosophy, but most people don't wake up and think, I would like to study philosophy. I'm like that, maybe you're like that. Most people wake up and they think, I'm bankrupt, or I'm overweight, or I have a number of problems, and I'm depressed, I'm adrift, whatever it is. I need help with that problem. And my understanding of these ancient philosophies is that they are designed to help with those things. Certainly, Stoicism is a much more Western philosophy. So, unlike the image of the Stoic philosopher is not in the way that a Buddhist might be in a beautiful temple on top of a rocky mountain or in a lush garden. The Stoic philosopher is the man in the marketplace, the emperor, the general, someone who's trying to has a job that they have to do, and they're looking for guidance in how to do that thing well. So I think you raise a great point. This is not just about how to aspire and achieve things, and you want to make sure that when you are driven, when you are trying to do those things, that it's not out of ego in and of itself. But plenty of divorces are caused by ego, and plenty of miserable childhoods are the result of egotistical parents, and so on and so forth. So I think they're very related, but that's just what this book is about.
Oh, thank you. And I love your last book, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Look forward to reading this one.
So I think that's all the time we have. So
Cool.
let's give Ryan another round of applause.
Thank you, guys.